Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It's Tuesday, October 27th, 2020, 1 week before the election. I have to say, I woke up this morning and I was feeling really stressed out. And I turned on the news and took a look at the paper. And as I'm sure all of you know, we're in the midst of a major surge of COVID infections, hospitalizations, and that's a number I think to watch very closely, and a dramatic rise in COVID deaths, not just here in the United States, but also throughout Western Europe. And so it was hard to predict when we were thinking about the course, what direction the pandemic would go. And there was some hope, I think, certainly I had it, that by the middle to the late semester, by the time of the election, perhaps the epidemic would be stabilized or at least controlled in some fundamental way. But clearly, it's not. And then, of course, we've all been thinking a lot about the election coming up and reading a lot about the election and concerned about the election. When I was reading this morning, I came across a literature on what's now being called election stress disorder. I read all the symptoms and it turns out I have it, as many of us do. And it's been very interesting. There's been some really considerable research on these questions, some of it done by our colleague at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, David Williams, who is celebrated for his fundamental discoveries of the impact of racism on Black and brown people and the impact it actually has on all of their health systems, their cardiovascular, neurologic, and other chronic and systemic diseases. And Williams had done a study after the 2016 election that showed that in the week after the 2016 election, there was a significant rise in heart attacks and strokes in the following week. And he recently had an article that suggested that there may be as many as 2 times as many cardiovascular events as occurs in a normal week following the election. There have been polls about whether Democrats are more stressed out than Republicans. They are slightly more stressed out. Independents are also fairly stressed out. I was reading the American Psychological Association put out a report about what to do about election stress disorder. It says, break the habit of ruminating on bad outcomes. That's going to be hard for me to do. It says, focus on what you can control, which at a time like this, we feel is almost nothing. It says, engage in meaningful activities. I consider our class a meaningful activity, so I'm glad you're here. It says, stay socially connected, go for a walk and spend time with friends and family. I think that the American Psychological Association forgot that we're socially distancing in the midst of a global pandemic. In any event, we do want all of you to know that we share your stress. We're here for you. We're going to be talking a lot about the election today. We're going to be talking about it in sections, but this is a very tough time. It's hard to imagine a time where you have a global pandemic, an incredibly divisive political situation, a mountain of misinformation, and a racial time of incredible importance, but also stress and anxiety. So all of these things are part of our discussion today. I've been looking forward to this session since we planned it, and we have some great observers of the contemporary election and political situation. So I'll turn it over to Ingrid to introduce our speakers, but I just remembered we have a poll. Do we have the poll today? Yes, great. Quick election poll.
Nice. Good job, you guys. 65%. That's awesome. You've done better already than the US electorate. So keep up the good work. Um, Interesting. A large number, a majority voted by mail. Definitely has affected your manner of voting, and very important. If you lump together COVID in very important and moderately important, that is by far the majority of you in thinking about this moment. Well, I will pick up the baton with that. That's, I think, really setting the stage for today. And we're so thrilled to have three phenomenal speakers today. We really, as Alan said, we tried to time the section, this particular discussion in the lead up to the election next week. And we have three just incredible scholars who are here to give us a really deep dive into this moment. And I think this discussion is going to be really pivotal. And we hope that you have a chance to really think through this over the course of this week and discuss it in your sections. I have the pleasure of introducing our three speakers. So I will start with our first speaker, Professor Jennifer Hochschild, who is the Henry LeBaire Jane Professor of Government at Harvard University and also Professor of African and African American Studies, Harvard College Professor, and the former chair of the Department of Government. She has also served as the president of the American Political Association. She is a leading scholar focused on the intersection of American politics and political philosophy, particularly in the area of race, ethnicity, immigration, as well as educational and social welfare policies. And her book from 2015 is particularly timely in this moment. It's titled Do Facts Matter? Information and Misinformation in American Politics. And that is really hitting this moment on its head in terms of how critical this intersection has been with COVID and the political process and how much misinformation has been at play. So we're really thrilled to get to hear from her today, and particularly thinking about this intersection of misinformation, a large public health crisis, and politics. Our second speaker is Professor Nicholas Stephanopoulos. He is a Harvard College grad and an expert on election law and constitutional law, and is a professor at Harvard Law School. He was previously professor of law and the Herbert Marjorie Freed Research Scholar at the University of Chicago Law School. And when he returned to us, he was, I believe, the first professor to teach on election law in 16 years at the law school. Certainly a very timely matter, something that is pretty much all many people can be thinking about right now. And he's really had path-breaking scholarship in the fields of election law, voting rights, and is just an exceptional teacher. And we are thrilled that he's going to speak with us today about the implications of the pandemic and voting. I mean, it's really very much leaning into that poll that you all just took when we're conceptualizing the election process and how this epidemic is shaping this moment. So we're thrilled to have him. And then as our third speaker, we have Professor Brandon Terry. He's also a Harvard College grad, and he is an assistant professor of African and African American Studies and Social Studies at Harvard University. And his work has really focused on the history and philosophy of civil rights, and is really a deep and skilled observer of contemporary political and racial issues in this country. He has focused on Black intellectual and political thought, and particularly in the context of contemporary political theory over the 19th and 20th century, and has really taken deep dives into the philosophy of race, racism, and the questions related to poverty, crime, and incarceration. We're thrilled to have him come and speak with us, particularly in this moment where COVID is impacting so many factors. And as we have discussed before, and Alan mentioned this, I believe as his analogy, it's when you walk into a dark closet and you flip on the light, all of those things have been in that closet, but it's suddenly blindingly clear for many people who were not able to see before what is there in front of us. And the pandemic has a way of doing that. So we are thrilled to have him come and join us today. 3 exceptional speakers, and I will pass over the baton now to our first speaker. Thank you all so much.
That's me, I believe. I first of all want to thank you for inviting me. I have to say I was vaguely contemplating trying to do a similar course or this kind of a course. And then of course discovered that Alan and his colleagues have already set it up. So there was no way in the world I was going to try to compete with that. So I'm thrilled to be able to participate in it. I think this is just a wonderful thing to be doing. And I may join you for the rest of the semester if I possibly can. So thank you very much. And thank you to all the students. What can I say other than this is a great thing to be doing. So I'm a political scientist. I'm not going to talk about the issues of race because Brandon's going to talk about those. And I'm not going to talk about the issues of electoral law because I don't know enough to do so. And luckily we have somebody who will. So I'm going to try to give a very broad overview of what I think is going to happen next week. And I don't have a clear prediction, but at least some underpinnings of what might happen next week. And I've got a few slides to share, which I will do. And I want to just say in advance, there's going to be more numbers on these than I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to want to talk about, but I thought I'd make them available either for later discussion this morning or for your discussion in the future. So when you see lots of numbers on some tables, don't panic because we're not going to talk about them all. So I'm Jennifer Hochschild. You've already got my introduction. You don't need anything more about that. So the first question is, how is the COVID going to change voting in the election? And my short answer is it won't. Or it won't at the level of sort of the 30,000 foot level of what the outcome is going to be. And my reason for suggesting this is these are data from 538, which I'm guessing many of us have been watching. And what you see in the first picture, the first image, is starting in January 2018, ending in January 2019. So the year before any of this, we ever imagined any of this coming. And basically these numbers are pretty flat. President Trump ranged around 40%, slightly more approval. Disapproval ranged around 55%. I mean, these are obviously corresponding numbers. The second picture starts in January 2020 and ends in, I think, October, yesterday, basically 2020. And the numbers don't look any different. President Trump has consistently had 40% and a little bit more support for the last couple of years. He continues to have 40% and a little bit more support. He's basically been floating around 43%. So if you look at from a very high level perspective, there's nothing going on with regard to COVID that is going to change. These are approval ratings. And so we assume that they're more or less the same thing as voting. Nothing's going to change. So what I want to talk about a little bit is why this, at least for me, somewhat surprising result occurs, and then why it might not be all of the story. It's again the 30,000 foot story, but if you come down maybe to 10,000 or 5,000 or 500 feet, it looks possibly a little bit different. So why is the big picture that COVID is not going to affect the election? One answer is because nobody's changing their mind. Whatever we know about President Trump and think about him and approve or disapprove, that's been pretty baked in for a long time. So this is a survey that was done in the 2 or 3 days after his announcement of his own coronavirus illness. And let's see, okay. And it's got 1,400 adults. It's a pretty good survey. And what you see when you can look at the party differences later on. I'm just going to focus on the overall results, which are in red here. The proportion who are voting for Trump and still are, 46%, voting for Trump still are, reconsidering, 1%, changed their mind, 1%, already voted. So at most, 3 or 4% of the population are reconsidering or actually changing their mind. Now, we know from 2016 that actually, if all of those people were concentrated in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, they could change the outcome of the election, but they probably aren't. And 1%, most people who study public opinion don't think a 1% result is a very meaningful one. So one answer is that people are just dug in. Whatever their views are, continue to be their views. Why are they dug in? And why is there so little impact of this startling announcement of President Trump's own virus? And then, of course, Vice President Pence, these data don't show the results of that infection in his office, but it's unlikely to have made any difference. Well, one answer is because if you look, MIP is the most important problem. And if you look at the results of what people, these are, again, it's a somewhat different survey, but also a very high quality survey, about 1,100 likely voters. So this is not the general population. These are people who are actually expected to vote according to their own claims. They're shown 25 issues. The answer is that the economy continues to be the most important problem for the largest share. Now, again, the difference between 15 and 14 isn't very great, but that's been the issue ever since well before the 2016 election. The economy consistently is what most people are worried about. There's lots more to say about that. I won't say more now, but the bottom line is that the economy is driving at least as many and arguably more people in their vote. Now, whether they think President Trump has done a great job with the economy or they think he's done a terrible job with the economy, that's again a separate question. Almost same share want to defeat Trump, so they're not going to change their vote as a result of these short-term COVID results. About 12% say COVID is the most important. It's most important for the Black population, twice as important for the Black population as for the white population, for all the kinds of reasons that you've already heard a little bit about, and Brandon will tell us much more. It's also most important for Democrats, but they're already not voting for President Trump, so it's not really changing their views. And then you go down healthcare, re-electing President Trump. A non-trivial proportion want to re-elect him, and that's, of course, the most important problem for Republicans, and not the most important problem for African Americans. Preserving democracy, all lives matter, Black lives matter, climate change, these are very small proportions. And in some ways, the most interesting one is this bottom segment. All of the things that most of us spend an awful lot of our time worrying about: criminal justice reform, social justice, immigration, gun control, terrorism, preventing autocracy, 3% or less. So basically, people have identified what their problem is. And for most people, it isn't COVID, and it isn't in any direct and immediate sense the president, or even the vice president who's running against him. Okay, so that's the 30,000-foot view. Is it possible that if we decline a little bit below that, we can actually see some impact of the coronavirus and of the 4,700 other things that have been going on simultaneously on this election? The core concept here the political scientists use to talk about it is the notion of motivated reasoning, which is a fancy term for you continue to believe what you've already believed. Psychologists have talked about this as cognitive dissonance reduction. There's a bunch of different terms for it. This is a definition in this top quote that comes from Psychology Today, I guess a more or less authoritative source. It's the bias toward a decision that confirms to what we already know, outside of awareness that anything's sneaky going on. And I think that's an important component to it. It's not that we deliberately choose misinformation, most of us, most of the time. It's not even that we necessarily live in our own friend or group or religious organization or social media bubble. A wonderful set of political scientists have written a book recently on electoral politics, and one of the titles, the title of one of their chapters is "It Feels Like We're Thinking." And that's what motivated reasoning is about. It feels as though we're actually paying attention to the news. We're absorbing new information. But consistently, and there's lots and lots and lots of evidence, I could talk more about some examples of this, people absorb the kind of information that already accords with what they believe, feel, want, care about. And they don't absorb the information that doesn't. And it's outside their awareness. Again, it's not an intentional, deliberate conspiracy theory. It's what people do psychologically. So this is an example of it from Representative Gatz, a Republican from Florida. If this, so one might have thought, I naively thought, which is why I started a piece of research, that Trump having gotten COVID would have a, oh my gosh, impact on at least some of his supporters or the undecideds. And the answer is, this is a kind of classic case of motivated reasoning. If the virus can get into the Oval Office, even the body of the president, there's no place it couldn't possibly infect one of our fellow Americans. There's no point in locking us down. There's no lockdown that can be a panacea. Nobody can save everybody from everything. This is proof that that's the case. So President Trump's own illness is not proof that he was treating this inappropriately and advising the rest of the country. This is a pandemic. What can you do? So that's the kind of the driving force behind motivated reasoning. And of course, you can ask yourself, as once in a while I do, what would change your mind? What would make you decide to vote for the presidential candidate tomorrow, who is the opposite person from the one you plan to vote for today? And I can't think of anything that would make me change my mind. And so I absorb information. I'm furious about the Supreme Court. I'm so furious about the pandemic. I'm furious about the economy. I'm furious about a bunch of things. Nothing that I can think of would make me change my mind. So why should we expect anybody else to? And, I'm not subject to motivated reasoning, of course. It's just all those other people. But this is a very powerful phenomenon. Having said that, it's not all powerful. And it is possible. There are psychological experiments, there's some political science evidence, there's some actual real world evidence that it's possible to overcome motivated reasoning. Very difficult, doesn't happen very often, but occasionally reality hits. And my favorite example currently is Governor Chris Christie, who of course himself was hospitalized with COVID. And he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and he's continued to say this in a variety of other places. A mask is not a partisan symbol. It's not a sign of weakness or virtue. It's just a good method to contain a cough. Geez, come on, guys, grow up. Wear it or you may regret it, as I did. So sometimes reality knocks you in the face and you psychologically are capable of overcoming the commitments that you have held very deeply and the beliefs that you have agreed to be true. There's other kinds of evidence. I won't go through it now, but again, I can talk about it later. If you ask people a question on a survey or an experiment, for example, and they give you the partisan response, and then you say, well, I'll give you $1 if you pay attention to the evidence that I'm going to provide for you, and then you think hard about what the right answer is. People change their minds. So when it's something even as trivial as $1 is at stake, you can actually overcome, at least in some circumstances, motivated reasoning. A message from a trusted leader can make you overcome motivated reasoning. Sometimes there's a racial component to this. There's a partisan component. There's a religious component. But again, there's some evidence that people will actually listen to what somebody whom they trust tells them. They won't listen to what somebody who opposes them tells them. And repeated signals. So if you get the same message over and over and over and over and over, sometimes that will have an impact. The best example, I'm doing some research on this right now, but since my research isn't done, I'm quoting somebody else. The gap between support for Trump and Biden grows in Biden's favor when a county has extremely high levels of coronavirus deaths related to when it has low levels. So something knocks you in the face, like Governor Christie, something's at stake, somebody whom you really trust tells you that you're making a mistake, you get the same, maybe low-level signal over and over and over and over. So it's possible to overcome motivated reasoning. But if you remember what I showed at the beginning, it doesn't happen very often. Okay, are there some longer term impacts of COVID on politics? I've got 3 quick things to say about that, and then I'll stop. One is that, this is the worrisome answer, of course, is that there's going to be there's already high levels, and we're going to have even higher levels of mistrust, disgust with, lack of confidence in the public sector and the media. So these are data from August about, do you trust, and the questions are, do you trust this figure a lot or some, a little bit or not at all? These are combining the some and a lot answers. Again, it's a big sample, it's a good survey. Do you trust Biden? 50%. Do you trust the news media? 47%. The White House? 46%. Donald Trump? 43%. Congress? 42%. Social media companies? 34%. People don't trust social media. These are pretty low numbers, particularly when you assume that they're both, I trust them a lot and I trust them some, which is a pretty wimpy answer. Even in combination, you barely get to above a third who trust social media. On the other hand, this is the same survey, and this is simply the other side of the question. It may be that people actually come to trust certain kinds of public sector or expert institutions or individuals a lot. These numbers are pretty high. Doctors and hospitals, Alan, you may be happy to hear this, are the highest. And this is consistent across surveys for decades. Scientists and researchers, we hear a lot about mistrust of experts. And in fact, 90% of the public in August, this is in the middle of the pandemic, say yes, they trust them. They still trust the CDC. Maybe they shouldn't right now, but in general, they believe that the CDC is expert. They trust Fauci. They trust their own city government. They even trust pharmaceutical. I mean, the pharmaceutical one surprised me, and this is a big change. And frankly, I'm there too. The pharmaceutical companies are saving us from dangerous vaccines. I can't believe I ever would have uttered that sentence, but at the moment, it seems to be the case. They have lots of economic motives. They haven't suddenly turned into, but nonetheless, people do trust pharma, and at this particular moment, maybe they're right. They trust their state government. They trust the police. Again, there are big partisan differences here, and there are also racial differences, which I haven't put up because it's already too many numbers here. But these numbers are pretty good. So it may, and in some cases, they're actually higher than in earlier surveys. So it may be that people are realizing that they need the public sector, they need experts, they need doctors, they even need the police, they need banks, maybe sort of, kind of. So it may be that there are actually some positive long-term political outcomes. This is the most speculative slide, and I didn't get very far on it because I couldn't persuade myself that I had anything really very powerful to say, but it may be, if we think about pandemics in the past, and again, this is not my arena, this is Professor Brandt's and other people's, there may be longer term implications, either for the better or for the worse, that we simply have no idea about right now. We won't see them for 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 years. Education is going to get transformed, public health system, the employment structure, perhaps movement out of the biggest cities, if people no longer trust hanging around very closely with lots of other people. The most interesting one for me, and again, this is pure speculation, is a possibility of a resurgence of the Democratic Party at local and state governments. We trust our local and state governments more than the national government. And persistent populism. Even if President Trump loses, his 40% support is not going to go away. The phenomenon that he brought to the surface is a deep and long-lasting and very important one. And there may actually be a resurgence of traditional conservatism, which has simply gotten stomped in the last 4 or 5 or 6 years. So possibly there'll be some sort of partisan realignment. We could end up with a 3-party system. I think that's unlikely given the American constitutional structure. But we may see over the next, again, this is going to be a 10 or 20-year period of playing out, ways in which the political configurations that we now kind of take for granted simply get reshuffled. So I will stop there. And thank you again for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Hochschild. That is really, those data are fascinating. And I feel like we could have the rest of this conversation just talking about those data.
Well, this is work that I'm doing right now, so I'm more than happy to talk about it more. And I've got, surveys coming out the wazoo, so we save it for later.
Okay, well, we'll put it into the Q&A. I will say just one quick comment, which is, it's fascinating to me the importance, and we've discussed this in other sections, of trust and who do you trust, and how potentially there is some malleability in one's thinking if you really are getting information from somebody that you trust. And I just think that's a fascinating concept. So with that in mind, we will pass the baton on to Professor Stephanopoulos.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Alan and Ingrid for inviting me to participate in this wonderful class. I was telling them right before the session began, there's a quite similar law school workshop that explores the implications of the pandemic for different areas of law. And I think it's so great how this class ratchets up the level of generality by a few more notches and explores the implications of the pandemic, not only for law, but for all of the many aspects of society. What an important and fascinating subject for a course. So I'll be speaking today about the intersection of the pandemic with election law, which also happens to be my own specialty. This is quite a significant intersection. So in the last few months, since the pandemic began, we've seen more than 300 lawsuits filed in more than 40 states around the country. This is by far an all-time high in the volume of pre-election litigation. We've never come anywhere near this much legal activity in the lead up to a vote. So I want to say first a few words about electoral legislation that we've seen over the last few months. And then I'll talk primarily about election law and COVID-related litigation that we've seen, which is where the more contentious disputes have arisen in recent months. So a critical background point here is that obviously the pandemic can prevent or deter certain people from voting. In-person voting in particular carries with it some risk of exposure to the virus. You might come into contact with other people, fellow voters or election administrators who are infected, or you might come into contact with contaminated surfaces. And so obviously there's some risk of exposure to the virus, which could deter some people from choosing to vote in person. Added to the risk of exposure as a deterrent is the fact that lines can be expected to be quite a bit longer to vote in person this year because of the pandemic. The capacity of polling places has been reduced in order to diminish the risk of infection. There have to be efforts to clean, to disinfect polling places throughout the day. Some number of election officials think that it's too unsafe for them to show up. And so staffing might be reduced at polling places. So you have a combination of factors that could deter voting. The risk of exposure itself and all the efforts taken by election officials to reduce the risk of exposure, which have the unwelcome side effect of lengthening, protracting the voting process for people. So in response to this reality, a substantial number of states across the country have voluntarily, democratically taken steps to make it easier to vote. Here are just a few examples. States like California, Nevada, New Jersey, and others have decided to send every single registered voter a mail-in ballot. This is so-called universal vote by mail. That's how this process works. And it's already in existence in some other states that had the policy in effect before the current election cycle. Quite a few other states, most notably swing states like Michigan and Wisconsin, have decided to send every voter a mail-in ballot application. So not the ballot itself, but rather an application that the citizen has to then return in order to be sent a mail-in ballot subsequently. And then quite a few other states, notably swing states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania, have extended various deadlines pertaining to the voting process. In particular, they've extended the deadlines for requesting absentee ballots and for returning absentee ballots to state officials. And all of this, in my view, is wonderful from the perspective of democratic participation. We have states choosing to facilitate voting, to enhance participation, to expand the number of voting options that are available to citizens. I think that's good policy, and a good deal of it might carry on after the pandemic is over. States that have adopted universal mail-in ballots or universal mail-in ballot applications might be unlikely to revert to their previous more restrictive policies once we're in the post-pandemic world. And if that's true, then this year will be remembered as one of the most important milestones in increasing voter participation in American politics. So that's the more benign category of legislation in response to the pandemic. So I want to now turn to the more contentious topic of COVID and election-related litigation. And we've seen three main categories of litigation, which I'll discuss in order by their prevalence in terms of the number of lawsuits that we've seen. So the most common claim that we've seen around the country is that the right to vote has been overly and unjustifiably burdened by particular state voting requirements. And so therefore, those requirements ought to be relaxed or waived in their entirety. We've seen those kinds of claims brought with respect to deadlines for requesting or returning mail-in ballots. We've seen those claims brought with respect to voter eligibility to use some of these mechanisms. We've also seen these claims with respect to witness requirements or notarization requirements for voting absentee, which exist in a number of states. So these are claims under the federal Constitution, and there are a few notable things about these claims. One is that the claims are what lawyers call as applied, not facial. So the claims are willing to concede the general validity of these various requirements. Rather, the lawsuits argue that these particular requirements are invalid as applied during the particular conditions of the pandemic. So they're lawsuits that are limited to 2020. They wouldn't result in the permanent invalidation of these state rules. The other interesting feature of these claims is the doctrinal test that they trigger. It's known as sliding scale scrutiny, and it's unique to this particular area of law. There's a two-part sequence to this analysis. So first, courts have to ask, how severe is the burden on voting that is imposed by these state policies under the circumstances of the pandemic? And then the degree of judicial stringency with which the measures are evaluated varies in tandem with what the court understands the severity of the burden to be. So a severe burden triggers what's known as strict scrutiny. A lighter burden will trigger something more like intermediate scrutiny or rational basis review, under which laws tend to be upheld. So in the courts, these claims have had a mixed record this year. Advocates have tended to be successful in lower courts, in trial courts. They've had a much worse record in the courts of appeals, which are now stacked full of Trump appointees who are hostile to these sorts of claims. And at the Supreme Court, these claims have had a universally or almost universally a poor record of failure. This, I think, is partly because the court simply doesn't value the right to vote as much as some other courts and observers. The court is much more willing to accept all sorts of state rationales for limiting or burdening the franchise. And it's also because the Supreme Court is very averse to late-breaking judicial intervention close to the date of an election, which the court thinks confuses voters and might dissuade them from voting. And so for those reasons, a plaintiff's record in front of the Supreme Court on these claims is something like 0-10 or maybe 1-11, depending how you count, over the last few months. Okay, the next most common claim that we've seen is sort of the opposite of the first category. It's litigation brought by conservative groups, including the Trump campaign itself, and it's litigation brought against states that have voluntarily chosen to make it easier to vote. The claim here is that those relaxed voting policies induce greater levels of voting fraud, and that resulting fraud in turn dilutes or negates the votes that are cast by honest, law-abiding citizens. So this is, again, a federal constitutional claim of vote dilution through the mechanism of fraud enablement or fraud facilitation. These claims have universally failed so far, and they failed for two reasons, I think. One is that there isn't any evidence there that making it easier to vote significantly increases the likelihood of fraud. And so without that evidence of fraud, the predicate for vote dilution via fraud evaporates. The second reason is that it's unclear if this is a real legal theory. The Supreme Court has never recognized this theory of vote dilution through fraud. And so what the Trump campaign is trying to do is convince courts to adopt a brand new constitutional claim. And understandably, courts have been resistant to doing that. Okay, I know I'm low on time, so let me just quickly go through the final category of litigation, which is the sort of late-breaking, most recent category that has emerged. This has to do with which actors have the authority to make changes to state voting rules. So in states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania in particular, we have state courts that are dominated by Democratic judges, alongside state legislatures that are dominated by Republican politicians. And a number of these state courts have ordered changes to election rules that were set by the state legislatures. So the state legislatures have sued, and the basis for their suits has been Article 2 of the Constitution, which appears as a textual matter to give state legislatures, and only state legislatures, the power to direct how presidential electors are allocated. So the argument here is that by failing to implement the laws passed by the state legislatures, the state courts have infringed the state legislatures' exclusive authority over presidential elections. And this argument has really disruptive, radical implications for presidential elections. It would suggest that governors, state courts, federal courts, the people themselves through direct democracy have no role to play in regulating presidential elections, because this matter, unique among all other policymaking matters, is solely the bailiwick of the state legislature. It's a radical argument, but it was accepted last night by Justice Kavanaugh in a long opinion. And so it's very much a live argument at this point that may continue to raise its head in election litigation. So I'll stop there. I'll just note in closing that I've only talked about lawsuits we've seen so far in the lead up to the election. I'd be happy in the Q&A to also talk about the kinds of litigation that we might see just after the election has concluded. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Stephanopoulos. I have to say, the idea of election litigation in the time where there's been such a massive turnover of justices, and really, I mean, I would defer to you, but it seems almost unprecedented in modern times in terms of stacking conservative justices throughout the federal courts, certainly has an impact on those outcomes. So we're looking forward to having that discussion with you in the Q&A. Finally, Professor Terry, we welcome you to come join us. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you both for inviting me. I always do anything for Professor Brandt, who is one of the main reasons that I'm here at Harvard. So it's an honor to be here. I'll try to be very swift, given that we're running low on time. So I basically wanted to discuss how the politics of the pandemic collided with the politics of race this summer, and how their interaction has shaped the broader political landscape, particularly in activist circles. And I also want to at least gesture toward how the politics of reckoning advocated by anti-racist movements, help us think through some of the decisive ethical and political issues confronting American democracy in what I think is a really dark time. So in thinking through the relationship between the COVID pandemic and Black Lives Matter, I think three things are especially important. First is that the series of incidents that led to the protest, Breonna Taylor's killing, Ahmaud Arbery's killing, George Floyd's death, as well as the harassment of Christian Cooper in Central Park, all unfolded against a broader background of the pandemic's disproportionate and racially unjust impact on Black communities. So far, about 1 out of every 900 African Americans has died from the pandemic, including roughly 1 out of every 100 African Americans over 65. My understanding is that you've talked about these disparities in great detail, but I just want to note that even among ostensibly working or middle-class Blacks, long noted wealth inequalities, the availability of assets, leaves even these groups without comparable access to wealth and savings, and makes it really difficult to leave dangerous jobs or housing, or even spend large cash outlays for groceries or other goods that would make quarantine safer for other populations, especially at the beginning of the pandemic and perhaps in the period we're going into now. I especially want to draw attention to my suspicion that beyond the noted overrepresentation of poorer Blacks in essential jobs in supermarkets, delivery services, and things like that, that even middle-class Blacks are overrepresented in government employment, more likely to be treated as essential. I think this explains somewhat how even relatively affluent Black communities like those in suburban Washington, D.C., have had some of the highest infection and casualty rates from the pandemic. They rely disproportionately on government labor. In early May, about 60% of all COVID deaths were in the 22% of US counties that are disproportionately Black. This stunning degree of death, coupled with a palpable sense that the benefits and burdens of social cooperation are not being shared equitably at all, led to a great deal of understandable rage and resentment for the protest movements of the summer to tap into. And this is especially true, and here's my second point, because the pandemic reduced many of the usual barriers to joining a social movement. So while it's increased barriers in a lot of other ways, it actually reduced some of the barriers to joining a social movement. I often try to explain to students when I teach about the civil rights era that, especially in the small town South, protest movements could reliably count on regular work schedules, few competing distractions for attention, and an ability to hold the attention and efficacy of all of the local stakeholders when they decided to act. Our society is not like that. We're awash in an endless array of entertainment options, irregular work schedules, fragmented and segregated social networks and media environments. And it was the pandemic more than anything in recent memory that softened these dynamics. It closed down many competitors in the economy of attention and inadvertently allowed for the spectacle of racist incidents and the protest response to pierce through the normal fog of distraction and indifference. Further, for those who were laid off, out of school, or working from home, there were fewer barriers to entry in joining the demonstrations than in a normal environment of more intensely competing obligations, where you'd have to decide to miss work or miss school. But lastly, I want to say there's a crucial and often overlooked element of the relationship between the pandemic and BLM, which is the last explanatory point I want to make. So it's long been a central element of political philosophers writing about civil disobedience that a critical part of what civil disobedience has to do is convince a public that is skeptical of brazen defiances of law and law enforcement of the protesters' sincerity and commitment, right? Why should we accept your breaking of the law if we're all following the law? Well, you have to convince us that you're being sincere and you're committed to some principle, and that it's worth this kind of disruption and disorder that you appear to be, at least on first glance, bringing into the polity. So John Rawls, the famous philosopher, argued that without demonstrating sincerity or commitment, most other citizens would likely view your movement as disruptive and dangerous, as a bunch of free riders on the shared rules of the polity. And for theorists of Rawls's era, this sincerity was supposed to be demonstrated by accepting punishment, right? That's how we know that you're sincere, is that you go to jail, you accept beatings in the street. But in our era, which is on the other side of the civil rights movement and under new regimes of policing, the honorifics that attach to protest are too positively valent. And the brutality of punishment often, not always this summer, but often, are too muted or bureaucratic to reliably signal the sense of risk that in the past people thought would underwrite this sense of sincerity and commitment in civil disobedience. So in an odd, paradoxical way, the act of protesting in the midst of a pandemic recovered some of the life or death drama of earlier stagings of civil disobedience in the United States. That one was taking their life into their hands in some sense, or at least it seemed to be taking their life into their hands by joining these protests in the midst of an unknown pandemic, helped break through the normal aesthetic and ethical reaction to peaceful racial justice demonstrations. So like the endurance constitutive of Occupy Wall Street's allure, or the danger of militarized violence in Ferguson, the protests this summer were able to discover a new source of authority and persuasive force via this form of acting amidst risk. So let me end by saying that while there were innumerable political views that emerged from the protests this summer, and we can talk about, some as radical as police abolition, others as asinine as the need to dethrone Uncle Ben from a box of rice, the most important argument underlying Black Lives Matter struggles is the age-old view in Black protest movements that our dignity as democratic citizens is tied up and others expressing respect for our most vital rights, right? Whether it's the basic right to due process or free movement that you see in the police cases, or the right to vote, which we're talking about today. And these rights will need vigilant, contentious civic action for protection at various times. And this is especially true given the widespread voter suppression. I encourage you all to watch Stacey Abrams' new documentary on Amazon Prime, which I think is excellent. But we're in an age of widespread voter suppression that represents, I think, that the kinds of things that Martin Luther King described as an assault on the very dignity of the disenfranchised. As King declared in 1957, so long as I do not firmly and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. I cannot make up my mind. It is made up for me. What voter suppression does is it attacks our freedom, our capacity to deliberate and weigh alternatives, to make decisions and take responsibility for the co-creation of society. We are under assault with powerful ideologies about the unfitness of poor people, people of color, and young people for political participation. These have been ideologies that are a big part of American history. And kind of one vicious circularity that's become central to the contemporary politics of race and partisanship, the very refusal of some minority groups, especially Blacks, to support Republicans is supposedly evidence itself of their immaturity and unfitness for full recognition. So Jared Kushner, who I overlapped with here at the college, just argued in this vein, suggesting that Black suspicion of the so-called Trump Platinum Plan for Black America, which sounds like it's marketed to 1990s rappers, is like prima facie evidence that Black people simply don't want to succeed enough. And I want you to understand in closing that this is infuriating, infantilizing ideology, part and parcel of a broader effort to legitimize forms of rule that are unaccountable to the judgments and assent of disadvantaged people. It is the polite face, if there is such a thing, of the more vicious and violent forms of voter roll purging, voter ID poll taxes, plain voter intimidation, gerrymandering, and ad hoc suppression that constitutes a pillar of conservative political rule in America. The energies of this summer have rightly been channeled into the ballot to peacefully remove the architects of these ills from office and begin reconstructing the fabric of American democracy on humane, progressive, and racially just grounds. But if these efforts are defeated, once again, by fraud, repression, and court machinations against democratic empowerment, I'm afraid we may find ourselves in an unprecedented moment of difficult choices to make about what manner of resistance is legitimate and honorable in the face of such sustained and vicious assaults on the dignity of democratic citizens. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Professor Terry. That was just so helpful, but inspiring and fantastic. And I just have to say, reflecting on these three presentations, confirms something that we really wanted to happen in these discussions, where we just heard from a political scientist thinking critically about the character of the electorate and reasoned motivation, an expert in the law of voting and the potentials for expanding the franchise at the same time that we're seeing incredible attacks on the most basic right to vote. And then your talk, Professor Terry, which puts this in a context of a deep and long racial struggle for equality and social justice. So these are really three, in some ways, what I'm so impressed with is hearing them next to one another. And I think they really represent so much about what's at stake in the current set of political debates, and specifically in this election. But all three of you raised fundamental issues about the deeper legacies of the conflicts we're experiencing now. So I want to I know we have some student questions, and I'm eager to get to those. Yvonne, do we have a student who'd like to ask a question?